When Clara Whitfield's stepfather sold her like livestock to a man who'd already buried 3 wives, she had two choices: submit or run. On a June night in 1875, with thunder splitting the Nebraska sky and her mother's blood-stained letters hidden in her coat, she chose the storm. But the plains are unforgiving, and exhaustion doesn't care about courage. When her horse finally collapsed and men's voices echoed through the rain, Clara stumbled toward the only light she could see, a cabin that might offer shelter or become another cage. What she found inside would change everything. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. And if you believe some strangers become family faster than blood ever could, stay until the end. Hit that like button and let's begin. The first crack of thunder came when Clara was 3 miles from the ranch, and she knew then that God, if he was listening, had chosen a side, and it wasn't hers. The sky had been threatening all afternoon, bruised purple at the edges and heavy with the kind of heat that made the air stick to your skin. Clara had waited for it. She'd packed what little she could carry into a canvas sack tied to her saddle. Her mother's letters, a tin cup, hardtack wrapped in cloth, and the small silver locket her father had given her mother before the fever took him. Everything else, the dresses her stepfather had bought to make her presentable, the hairbrush with the ivory handle, the life she was supposed to accept, she left behind without a second glance. She'd chosen Rusty, the older gelding, because he was steady and wouldn't spook easy. The younger horses were faster, but speed wouldn't matter if the animal panicked and threw her. Rusty had carried her mother on the journey west 15 years ago, and he knew how to survive. Clara led him out of the barn just after sunset, when her stepfather Dale Whitfield was in town finalizing the arrangements, signing papers that sold her future to a man named Cyrus Brennan, a cattle broker from Omaha with land, money, and a reputation for working his wives into early graves. She'd met him once. He'd looked at her the way men looked at horses at auction, checking her teeth and bones and childbearing potential without ever meeting her eyes. Dale had smiled through the whole thing, his hand heavy on her shoulder, his voice warm and fatherly for the audience. "Claire's a good girl," he'd said. "Strong, quiet. She'll serve you well." She'd felt the bile rise in her throat, but she'd kept her face blank, her hands folded, her mouth shut. Survival had taught her that much. It wasn't until she'd overheard him laughing with Brennan over whiskey. She don't know it yet, but the wedding's set for Saturday. No point giving her time to get foolish ideas. That Clara realized waiting was the same as dying. So she didn't wait. The storm hit hard and fast the way plain storms always did. One moment the sky was holding its breath, and the next it opened up like a wound. Sheets of rain driving sideways with a wind that tried to pull her from the saddle. Lightning split the darkness in jagged white lines, and thunder followed close enough that she could feel it in her chest. Rusty kept moving, head down, ears pinned back. Clara bent low over his neck, her hands tangled in his mane, rain streaming into her eyes and soaking through her coat. She'd tied her hair back with a leather cord, but it had come loose hours ago, heavy and cold against her neck. The letters were wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside her shirt, pressed against her ribs. She could feel them there, a weight that had nothing to do with paper. Her mother had written them in the weeks before she died, when the sickness had taken her voice but not her clarity. Clara had found them hidden in the seam of an old quilt, stitched there deliberately, meant to be discovered. "If something happens to me, don't trust Dale. He's not what he seems. There are things I should have told you. Go to Fort Kearney. Find a woman named Margaret Ross. She'll help you. She knows the truth." Clara hadn't understood then. She'd been 16, grieving, and desperate to believe that her stepfather's sudden attentiveness was real, that his promises to take care of her were genuine. It had taken 2 years to learn otherwise. The rain was coming down so hard now that she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Rusty stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. Clara felt the shift in his gait, the exhaustion creeping into his muscles. They'd been riding for hours, pushing hard across open country with no cover and no road, just instinct and desperation pointing them north. "Come on, boy," she whispered, her voice lost in the storm. "Just a little farther." But farther to where? She had no map, no landmarks in the dark. Fort Kearney was 2 days' ride north and east if she judged the distance right. If she hadn't, she could be heading straight into empty prairie with nothing but sky and grass until her supplies ran out or Rusty collapsed. Another crack of lightning, close enough that the hair on her arms stood up. In the flash of light, she saw it, a dark shape against the horizon, low and solid. A building. Maybe a barn, maybe a cabin. It didn't matter, it was shelter. She turned Rusty toward it, urging him forward. He responded, but barely, his breath coming in heavy snorts. She could feel him shaking beneath her, muscles twitching with effort. The structure took shape as they got closer, a small cabin, rough-built but intact, with a narrow porch and a stone chimney. No light in the windows, no smoke. It looked abandoned, or at least empty. Clara slid from the saddle before Rusty had fully stopped, her legs nearly buckling when her boots hit the mud. She grabbed his reins and led him toward a lean-to shed attached to the side of the cabin, barely big enough for one horse but dry. She got him inside, unsaddled him with shaking hands, and used her coat to rub him down as best she could. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his neck. "I'm so sorry." Rusty huffed, too tired to do anything but stand there, sides heaving. Clara took her saddlebag and sack, slung them over her shoulder, and ran for the cabin door. It was latched, but not locked. She lifted the wooden bar and pushed inside, stumbling into darkness that smelled like smoke, leather, and something earthy, coffee maybe, or dried herbs. She stood there dripping, trying to catch her breath, waiting for her eyes to adjust. The cabin was small. One room, a stone hearth on the far wall, a rough-built table with 2 chairs, a trunk in the corner, and a cot against the wall with a wool blanket folded at the foot. Clean, sparse, lived in but not crowded. Whoever stayed here wasn't a settler. No family, no clutter, no signs of permanence. A traveler, then, or someone who didn't plan to stay. Claire's heart was still hammering. She set her bag down, moved to the hearth, and found kindling stacked neatly beside it. Matches in a tin on the mantel. Her hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to strike one, but finally the kindling caught, and she fed it carefully until the flames grew. The warmth hit her like a living thing, and she sank down in front of the fire, pulling her knees to her chest. Her dress was soaked through, her hair dripping onto the floorboards. She should change. She should eat something. She should check the door, make sure it was secure. But all she could do was sit there and shake, the weight of the last 8 hours crashing down on her all at once. She'd done it. She'd actually run. And she had no idea what happened next. The fire had burned down to coals when Clara heard the footsteps on the porch. She was on her feet instantly, her hand going to the knife she'd tucked into her belt. A small blade, meant for cutting rope or opening cans, but it was all she had. Her pulse spiked, her breath catching in her throat. The door opened. The man who stepped inside was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked to the bone. He wore a long oilskin coat that dripped water onto the floor, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, and a rifle slung across his back. He stopped the moment he saw her, his hand still on the door, his body going very still. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he spoke, his voice low and careful. "Easy." Clara tightened her grip on the knife, her heart pounding so hard she thought he could probably hear it. "Stay back." He held up one hand, slow and deliberate, the other still on the door. "I'm not going to hurt you." "I said stay back." He studied her for a moment, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, then nodded once. "All right." He stepped back onto the porch, still holding the door open, rain hammering down behind him. "This is my cabin. I live here. I'm guessing you didn't know that when you came in." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. My horse was exhausted. The storm. I saw him in the lean-to." The man's tone didn't change, still calm, still even. "He looks rough. You've been riding hard." She didn't answer. The man glanced past her at the fire, then back to her face. "I'm going to come inside now. I'm not going to come near you. I'm just going to close the door and get out of the rain. That all right?" Clara's hand trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go, just the storm and the dark and Rusty, who couldn't carry her another mile tonight. "All right," she whispered. He stepped inside, closed the door quietly, and moved to the far side of the room, giving her as much space as the small cabin allowed. He set his rifle against the wall, shrugged out of his coat, and hung it on a peg near the door. Beneath it, he wore a faded shirt, suspenders, and trousers tucked into worn boots. He pulled off his hat and set it on the table, and Clara finally got a clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, maybe a little older. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face weathered by sun and wind, but not unkind. There was a scar along his jaw, faint and old, and stubble that suggested he hadn't shaved in a few days. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then turned his attention to the fire. "You mind if I add some wood? It's going to be a cold night." Clara hesitated, then shook her head. He crouched by the hearth, moving slowly, and fed a few logs into the coals. The flames caught, light spreading across the room. He stayed where he was, his back to her, giving her time. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet. "You running from something or to something?" Clara's grip on the knife didn't loosen. "Why does it matter?" "Doesn't, I guess." He straightened, brushed his hands off, and moved to the table. He sat down in one of the chairs, leaning back, his hands visible, his posture open, non-threatening. "But if someone's coming after you, I'd like to know before they show up at my door." She didn't answer. He waited, watching her with those dark, steady eyes, and then he nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He reached for a tin on the table, opened it, and pulled out a piece of jerky. He tore off a chunk and chewed it slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where rain lashed against the glass. Clara stood there, her back to the wall, her hand still on the knife, and tried to decide if she'd just traded one kind of danger for another. Well, she didn't sleep. The man, he'd said his name was Jacob Hale, had given her the cot without argument. He'd pulled a bedroll from the trunk, spread it on the floor near the hearth, and settled in with his back to her, his rifle within reach but not in hand. "You're safe here," he'd said before he closed his eyes. "I give you my word." Clara didn't believe him. She'd heard promises before, so she sat on the edge of the cot, the knife in her lap, and watched him through the long hours of the night. She watched the rise and fall of his breathing, the way his hand stayed loose and open even in sleep, the way he didn't move toward her once. The storm raged outside, wind rattling the shutters, rain drumming against the roof. Inside, the fire crackled low, and the silence between them stretched taut as wire. Somewhere toward dawn, exhaustion finally dragged her under. She woke to pale gray light filtering through the window and the smell of coffee. Jacob was at the hearth, crouched in front of the fire, a small pot balanced on the coals. He glanced over his shoulder when he heard her stir, then turned back to the coffee without comment. Clara sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching. She still had the knife. He still hadn't come near her. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "And I've got biscuits in the tin if you're hungry." She didn't move. Jacob poured coffee into a tin cup, set it on the table, and stepped back. "I'm going to check on your horse. I'll be outside for a bit. Door's not locked." He pulled on his coat, picked up his hat, and walked out into the gray morning light. Clara stared at the closed door for a long time. Then she looked at the coffee, steam rising in a lazy curl. Slowly, carefully, she stood and crossed the room. She picked up the cup, wrapped her cold hands around it, and drank. It was strong, bitter, and the best thing she'd tasted in days. When Jacob came back inside, Clara was standing by the window, watching the rain. It had slowed to a steady drizzle, the worst of the storm spent, but the sky was still low and gray. "Your horse is all right," Jacob said, shaking water from his coat. "He's tired, but he'll recover. Gave him some oats and fresh water." He paused. "He trusts you. Doesn't spook when you're near. That says something." Clara turned to look at him. "What does it say?" "That you're not cruel." Jacob hung his coat back on the peg and moved to the table. "Cruelty leaves marks. Animals remember." She didn't know what to say to that. Jacob sat down, poured himself coffee, and leaned back in the chair. "I ride route for the stage line. Kearney to North Platte. Sometimes farther west if they need me. I check the stations, carry mail, keep an eye on things. This cabin's one of my stops. Nobody else uses it." He met her eyes. "Which means nobody's going to come looking for you here unless you tell them where you are." Clara's fingers tightened on the cup. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're scared, and you're trying to figure out if I'm a threat." He took a sip of coffee, his expression calm. I'm not. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't see what's in front of me. You're running. Someone hurt you or someone's trying to, and you ended up here by accident. I didn't mean to. I know. His voice was steady, without judgment. And I'm not asking you to leave. Storm's not done yet, and your horse needs rest. You can stay as long as you need. Clara stared at him, searching his face for the lie, the trap, the moment when the kindness would turn into something else. It didn't come. I don't understand, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you help me? Jacob set his cup down, his gaze steady. Because someone should have helped you before it got this bad. And because if I don't, I'm no better than whoever made you run in the first place. Something cracked open in Clara's chest, sharp and sudden, and she turned away before he could see the tears. They didn't talk much that first day. Jacob worked around the cabin, mending a saddle strap, oiling his rifle, organizing supplies, while Clara sat by the fire and tried to stop shaking. Every time she heard a noise outside, her heart jumped. Every time Jacob moved, she tracked him with her eyes. He noticed. Of course he noticed. But he didn't comment. He just gave her space, kept his movements slow and predictable, and made sure she always knew where he was. By midday, the rain had stopped, and Jacob went out to check the perimeter. Clara watched him through the window, the way he moved through the trees with easy confidence, scanning the horizon like he expected trouble but wasn't afraid of it. When he came back, he brought wood for the fire and a rabbit he'd snared. You know how to cook? He asked, setting the rabbit on the table. Clara nodded. Good. I'm terrible at it. He pulled a knife from his belt and handed it to her, handle first. I'll clean it if you'll cook it. She hesitated, then took the knife. It was bigger than the one she'd been carrying, balanced and sharp, the kind of blade that could gut a deer or defend a life. Jacob saw her looking at it. You can keep that one if you want, he said quietly. The one you've got's too small. Won't do you much good if you need it. Clara's throat tightened. I don't need... Maybe not. Jacob moved to the door, paused with his hand on the latch. But it's there if you do. He went outside, and Clara stood there holding the knife, feeling the weight of it, the promise of it. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel completely helpless. That night, after they'd eaten and the fire had burned low, Jacob asked the question Clara had been dreading. Where were you headed? Before the storm. Clara sat on the cot, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Jacob had made from dried leaves he kept in a jar. It tasted like mint and something bitter, but it was warm, and it gave her something to hold on to. Fort Kearney, she said finally. Jacob nodded slowly. That's 2 days' ride northeast. Hard country between here and there, especially alone. I know. You have someone there? Family? A woman my mother knew. Margaret Ross. Jacob's expression shifted just slightly. Recognition, maybe, or respect. Margaret Ross runs the boarding house near the fort. Good woman, smart, doesn't take nonsense from anyone. He paused. Your mother trusted her? Yes. Then she had good instincts. Jacob leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Fort Kearney's on my route. I'm heading that way in 3 days, once the ground dries out enough for the stage to run. You can ride with me if you want. Safer than going alone. Clara looked up sharply. Why would you do that? Because it's the right thing to do. Jacob's voice was calm, matter of fact. And because I've seen what happens to women who travel alone out here. It's not pretty. Clara's hands trembled around the cup. You don't know me. You don't know what I'm running from. No, Jacob agreed, but I know what running looks like. And I know that whatever you're leaving behind is worse than the risk you're taking. He met her eyes. Am I wrong? She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him it was none of his business, that she didn't need his help, that she could make it on her own. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she whispered, My stepfather sold me. To a man who's already buried 3 wives. The wedding was supposed to be in 2 days. Jacob's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the scar. Does he know you're gone yet? Yes, Clara's voice cracked. He'll come looking. He has men, ranch hands, friends in town. They'll track me. How many? I don't know. 3, maybe 4. Jacob nodded slowly, his expression hardening into something cold and sharp. Then we need to move before they get close. Can you ride tomorrow if we take it slow? Clara thought of Rusty, exhausted and lame. I don't know if my horse can. Then you'll ride with me. We'll pony your horse behind. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. Jacob stood, moved to the window, and looked out into the darkness. I'm offering. There's a difference. Clara stared at him, this stranger who'd given her shelter, food, space, and now protection, and she didn't understand any of it. Why? She asked again, her voice breaking. Why do you care? Jacob was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough. My sister ran once, from a man who said he loved her. She didn't make it far enough. He turned to look at Clara, and there was something raw in his eyes, something that made her chest ache. So when I see someone running, I help, because maybe if someone had helped her, she'd still be here. Clara's breath caught. Jacob turned back to the window. Get some rest. We leave at first light. Clara didn't argue. She lay down on the cot, pulled the blanket over herself, and listened to the sound of Jacob moving around the cabin, checking the door, banking the fire, settling into his bedroll. She thought about her mother's letters still pressed against her ribs. She thought about Margaret Ross, a woman she'd never met but who represented the only thread of hope she had left. She thought about the men who would come looking for her, and the man 2 feet away who'd promised to stand between them. And for the first time since her mother died, Clara let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters. But inside, the fire burned steady, and Clara finally slept. Morning came cold and clear, the storm scrubbed sky pale blue and endless. Clara woke to the sound of Jacob moving around outside, the low murmur of his voice as he talked to the horses. She sat up slowly, her body stiff, and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, but Jacob had left fresh kindling stacked beside it and matches on the mantel. Clara rebuilt the fire herself, her hands steadier than they'd been the night before. By the time Jacob came back inside, she'd boiled water for coffee and found the tin of biscuits he'd mentioned. He stopped in the doorway, surprised. You didn't have to do that. You've done enough. Clara poured coffee into 2 cups, her movements careful. It's the least I can do. Jacob accepted the cup with a nod, something like approval in his eyes. Your horse is better this morning, still favoring his left front, but he'll manage if we don't push. My horse can carry us both. Clara's stomach tightened at the thought of riding that close to him, but she nodded. All right. They ate in silence, the easy kind that didn't need filling. When they finished, Jacob packed supplies into saddlebags while Clara gathered her things, her mother's letters, the locket, the small knife Jacob had given her. Everything she owned fit into a canvas sack that weighed almost nothing. Jacob saddled his horse, a big bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm temperament, and tied Rusty's lead rope to the saddle horn. Then he turned to Clara and held out his hand. She stared at it for a moment, then took it. His grip was strong, calloused, and careful. He helped her into the saddle, then swung up behind her, settling into place with the easy grace of someone who'd spent half his life on horseback. You all right? He asked quietly, his voice close to her ear. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Jacob nudged the bay forward, and they rode out into the morning light. They traveled northeast, following game trails and old wagon ruts, keeping to the low ground where the trees offered cover. Jacob rode with the ease of someone who knew the land intimately, every ridge and valley, every creek and shortcut. Clara sat stiff in front of him, hyper-aware of his presence, the warmth of him at her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his arm occasionally brushed hers as he adjusted the reins. He didn't try to talk. He just rode, watchful and calm, scanning the horizon with the kind of attention that came from years of expecting trouble. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses near a narrow creek. Jacob helped Clara down, then tended to the animals while she filled their canteens and washed her face in the cold water. When she straightened, she found him watching her. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. You're stronger than you think, Jacob said quietly. Most people wouldn't have made it this far. Clara looked away. I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice. Jacob crouched by the creek, filled his own canteen. Yours was just harder than most. They rode on through the afternoon, the sun climbing higher, the air warming just enough to take the edge off the cold. The land rolled out ahead of them, endless and empty, and Clara felt both exposed and invisible at the same time. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Jacob pulled the bay to a stop on a low rise and pointed northeast. See that line of trees? That's the Platte. Fort Kearny's another day's ride past it. We'll camp here tonight, cross the river in the morning. Clara followed his gaze, her heart beating faster. One more day. One more day, and she'd reach Margaret Ross. One more day, and maybe, she'd be safe. Jacob set up camp with quiet efficiency, unsaddling the horses, building a small fire, laying out bedrolls. Clara helped where she could, still cautious, still waiting for the moment when his kindness would turn into expectation. It didn't come. They ate jerky and hardtack, washed down with creek water, and sat in companionable silence as the stars came out overhead. Can I ask you something? Clara said finally, her voice soft. Jacob glanced at her. Go ahead. Your sister. What was her name? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the fire. Emily. I'm sorry. Me too. He poked at the coals with a stick, his expression distant. She was 16. Thought she was in love. By the time she realized she wasn't, it was too late. Clara's chest ached. It wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? Jacob's voice was rough. I knew something was wrong. I saw the bruises, the way she flinched, but I didn't push, didn't make her talk about it, figured she'd tell me when she was ready. He looked up, his eyes dark. She never got the chance. Clara didn't know what to say, so she said the only thing that felt true. You're helping me. That means something. Jacob met her gaze, and something shifted in his expression. Grief, maybe, or redemption. I hope so. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them, the night vast and quiet around them. And when Clara finally lay down to sleep, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not safe. Not yet. But close. The crossing at the Platte came just after dawn, when the water ran cold and fast from the storm 2 nights before. Jacob rode the bay into the current first, testing the depth, while Clara held her breath and watched the brown water swirl around the horse's legs. Rusty followed on the lead rope, his ears flat but his steps steady. The river wasn't deep, maybe 3 feet at its deepest point, but the current was strong enough to pull at them, and the rocks beneath were slick with moss. Jacob kept the bay angled upstream, compensating for the drift, his hand steady on the reins. Doing fine, he said over his shoulder, his voice calm. Almost through. Clara gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles white. She'd never been comfortable in water, not since her father had drowned crossing a swollen creek when she was 6. Her mother had held her back from the edge, her arms like iron, while men with ropes tried to reach him. They hadn't reached him in time. Clara. Jacob's voice cut through the memory. Look at me. She did, and his eyes were steady, dark, and certain. We're all right, he said. I've got you. And somehow, she believed him. The bay surged up the far bank, water streaming from his legs, and Rusty scrambled after. They were through. Jacob didn't stop. He kept the horses moving until they were well clear of the river, then finally reined in and turned to look at her. You all right? Clara nodded, though her heart was still racing. I don't like water. I noticed. Jacob swung down from the saddle, then reached up to help her. His hands were careful at her waist, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing. We'll rest here a minute. Let the horses shake off. He didn't let go immediately, and Clara realized she was trembling. Not from the cold, from everything. From the last 3 days, the running, the fear, the impossible kindness of this stranger who kept his promises. Hey, Jacob's voice was quiet, his hand still steady at her waist. You're safe. I told you. I've got you. Clara stepped back, putting distance between them, her arms wrapped around herself. You keep saying that. Because it's true. You don't know that. Her voice cracked. You don't know what they'll do if they find us. My stepfather, Dale, he doesn't let things go. He'll come. And when he does, then I'll handle it. Jacob's tone didn't change, didn't waver. But right now, we're ahead of them. And by tonight, you'll be with Margaret Ross, and she'll make sure you stay safe. Clara wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly it hurt. But she'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it real. Jacob seemed to sense it. He stepped back, giving her space, and turned his attention to the horses. We've got maybe 6 hours to the fort. We'll take it steady, keep to cover where we can. If we're lucky, we'll get there before dark. Clara wiped her eyes quickly, angry at herself for the weakness. And if we're not lucky? Jacob pulled the cinch tight on his saddle, checked the lead rope on Rusty. Then we camp outside the fort and go in at first light. Either way, you'll be there soon. He mounted up, held out his hand, and after a moment Clara took it. They rode on through the morning, the land rising gradually into low hills covered with sage and buffalo grass. The sky stayed clear, pale blue stretching from horizon to horizon, and the sun warmed Clara's back through her coat. She tried to relax against Jacob's chest, to stop fighting the rhythm of the horse and the steady presence of the man behind her. It was harder than it should have been. 2 years of tension, of waiting for the next threat, had taught her body that safety was a lie. But Jacob never pushed. He kept his arm loose around her, the reins held in one hand, his attention on the land ahead. Every so often he'd point out something, a hawk riding the thermals, a herd of antelope in the distance, the way the grass changed color where water ran underground. Small things, easy things, the kind of conversation that didn't demand anything from her. And slowly, carefully, Clara felt some of the tightness in her chest begin to ease. They stopped at midday near a cluster of cottonwoods that marked a dry creek bed. Jacob helped her down, handed her a canteen, and moved off to check the horses. Clara drank, then sat on a fallen log and pulled out the oilcloth packet she'd been carrying against her ribs. Her mother's letters. She'd read them a dozen times, but she opened them again now, needing the connection. The first one was dated 3 weeks before her mother died. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then I am gone and you are alone with Dale. I pray I am wrong to write this. I pray that the sickness will pass and I will live to tell you these things myself. But I feel time slipping away and there are truths you must know. Dale is not what he seems. I married him believing he was a good man who would care for us after your father's death. I was wrong. He came to us with a plan. He needed a wife, a respectable front, to hide what he truly is. He has debts, Clara, dangerous debts to dangerous men, and he has used our ranch, our name, to launder money and hide stolen goods. I discovered this by accident, going through papers I should not have seen. When I confronted him, he hurt me, Clara. Not with his hands, he is too clever for that, but with words, with threats, with the slow poison of fear. He said if I ever spoke of what I knew, he would make sure you suffered for it. And I believed him. So I stayed silent. And the sickness came, and I wonder now if it was truly sickness at all. Go to Margaret Ross at Fort Kearney. She knows what Dale is. She has evidence that can bring him to justice. Trust her. Trust no one else. I am sorry, my darling girl. I am sorry I was not strong enough to protect you, but you are stronger than you know. You are your father's daughter, and you will survive this. All my love, Mama. Clara's hand shook as she folded the letter and tucked it back into the oilcloth. She'd read it so many times the words were burned into her memory, but they still cut like glass. Bad news? She looked up to find Jacob standing a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. Old news, Clara said quietly, but still bad. Jacob didn't push. He just sat down on the log beside her, leaving space between them, and pulled a piece of jerky from his saddlebag. He tore it in half and offered her a piece. Clara took it, chewed slowly. It was tough and salty and gave her something to focus on besides the ache in her chest. My mother thought my stepfather might have poisoned her, she said finally, the words coming out flat and hard. She was healthy one day, sick the next. The doctor said it was her heart, but she didn't believe him. She wrote these letters and hid them where he wouldn't find them. Jacob's jaw tightened. What else do they say? That Dale's a thief, that he used our ranch to hide illegal business, That Margaret Ross has proof. Clara looked down at her hands. My mother thought if she stayed quiet, Dale would leave me alone. But after she died, he changed, started watching me, controlling where I went, who I talked to, and then he arranged the marriage to Cyrus Brennan. To get rid of you. Or to sell me. Clara's voice cracked. Brennan paid him. I heard them talking about it, $500 plus a stake in Brennan's cattle operation. Dale called it a business arrangement. Jacob swore under his breath, low and vicious. Clara looked at him, surprised by the anger in his voice. You believe me? Why wouldn't I? Because you don't know me. Because I have no proof except letters from a dead woman and my word against a man who owns half the county. Jacob turned to face her fully, his eyes hard. I believe you because I've seen men like Dale Whitfield before. Men who think women are property they can trade or use or throw away when they're done. And I believe you because you risked your life to get away from him. He paused, his voice dropping. That's not something people do lightly. Clara felt something crack open inside her, sharp and painful, and strangely liberating. Thank you. Jacob nodded once, then stood and offered her his hand. Come on, we're close now. Let's get you to the fort. They rode hard through the afternoon, pushing the horses as much as they dared. The land opened up into rolling prairie, and in the distance Clara could see the dark line of buildings that marked Fort Kearney. Squat structures clustered around a parade ground with supply wagons and tents spreading out beyond the walls. Civilization. Safety. An end to running. But as they drew closer, Jacob slowed the bay and pulled off the main road, guiding them into a stand of trees that offered cover. Clara twisted to look at him. What's wrong? Maybe nothing. Jacob's eyes were on the road ahead, where a group of riders was approaching the fort from the south. But I don't take chances. Clara followed his gaze and felt her blood go cold. 4 men on horseback, one of them riding a big roan that she recognized, Dale's horse. It's them, she whispered, her heart hammering. That's my stepfather. Jacob's arm tightened around her, protective and sure. Easy. They haven't seen us. We're downwind and in cover. What do? We wait. Watch where they go. Then we decide. They stayed hidden in the trees, the horses silent and still, while Dale and his men rode past less than 100 yards away. Clara could see her stepfather clearly now, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hard beneath his hat, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. He looked angry and determined. The men rode straight for the fort, and Clara's stomach sank. He's going to ask about me. He'll tell them I'm a runaway. He'll say I'm his daughter, and he's come to bring me home. Probably. Jacob watched the men disappear through the fort gates. But Margaret Ross knows better. If she's half the woman people say she is, she won't give you up without a fight. What if she's not there? What if they find her first and... Clara. Jacob turned the bay, heading deeper into the trees. Stop. We're not going to the fort right now, not with them inside. But we have to... I need to see Margaret. And you will, but not yet. Jacob's voice was calm, steady, the kind of calm that came from experience. Right now we're going to circle around, find a place to watch, and wait. Once they leave, or once we know where they are, we'll get you to Margaret safely. Clara wanted to argue, but the fear choking her throat wouldn't let the words out. Jacob found a sheltered spot half a mile from the fort, tucked into a ravine with a clear view of the road. He dismounted, helped Clara down, and tied the horses where they could graze but wouldn't be visible from the main trail. Then he pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard and checked the load. Clara watched him, her pulse racing. You think they'll come looking? I think they'll try. Jacob's hands were steady on the rifle. But they don't know we're here, and as long as we're careful, they won't find out. He settled against a rock, the rifle across his knees, and gestured for Clara to sit beside him. She did, her body tense, her eyes on the road. They waited as the sun crawled across the sky. An hour passed, then 2. Clara's nerves stretched tighter with every minute, every sound making her jump. Jacob stayed calm, his gaze never leaving the fort. He didn't try to reassure her with empty words. He just sat there, solid and certain, a presence that said without speaking, I'm here. You're not alone. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, The fort gates opened and the four riders emerged. Clara held her breath. Dale was in the lead, his face like carved stone. The men with him looked frustrated, angry. They rode south, back the way they'd come, and didn't slow down. Jacob watched until they were out of sight, then waited another 20 minutes before he finally lowered the rifle. "They didn't find you," he said quietly, "and they're heading back toward your stepfather's ranch. That gives us time." Clara let out a shaky breath. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Maybe, but not tonight." Jacob stood, offered her his hand. "Come on, let's get you to Margaret before the light fails." They rode into the fort just as the lamps were being lit, the bay's hooves clopping softly on the hard-packed dirt. Soldiers stood guard at the gates, but they waved Jacob through with nods of recognition. "You know them?" Clara asked. "I ride through here twice a month," Jacob said. They know me." He guided the bay through the compound, past supply sheds and barracks, to a 2-story building with a painted sign, Ross Boarding House. Clara's heart was in her throat as Jacob helped her down. Her legs felt weak, unsteady, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. Jacob steadied her, his hands firm at her elbows. "You're all right. We made it." The door to the boarding house opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was in her 50s, tall and slim, with graying hair pinned up in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Jacob Hale," she said, her voice warm but curious. "I wasn't expecting you for another week." "I brought someone who needs your help, Margaret." Jacob moved aside so the woman could see Clara clearly. "This is Clara Whitfield. I think you've been expecting her." Margaret's expression changed instantly. Surprise, recognition, and something that looked like grief all flickering across her face in the space of a heartbeat. Then she stepped down from the porch and took Clara's hands in hers, her grip strong and sure. "Mary's daughter," she said softly, her eyes searching Clara's face. "I see her in you. I see him too. Your father. Oh, child, I'm so sorry." Clara's composure shattered. The tears she'd been holding back for 3 days, for 2 years, for a lifetime, finally broke free, and she collapsed into Margaret's arms. The older woman held her, steady and unshakable, one hand stroking her hair. "You're safe now," Margaret murmured. "You're safe. He can't touch you here." Over Clara's shoulder, Margaret met Jacob's eyes. "He came looking for her, didn't he? Dale Whitfield." Jacob nodded. "About 2 hours ago. He had 3 men with him. They didn't find what they were looking for." "No," Margaret said, her voice turning hard as iron. "And they won't." She guided Clara toward the house, and Jacob followed, leading the horses. Inside, the boarding house was warm and clean, smelling of bread and wood smoke. Margaret settled Clara into a chair by the fire, wrapped a quilt around her shoulders, and pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. Then she sat down across from her and waited. Clara took a shaky breath, pulled the oilcloth packet from her coat, and handed it to Margaret. "My mother said you'd know what to do with these." Margaret opened the packet, unfolded the letters, and read them in silence. Her face went pale, then flushed with anger. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with fury. "Your mother was a brave woman, and she was right about all of it. I have the proof she mentioned, hidden where Dale can't reach it. Documents, records, testimony from men he cheated. I've been waiting for the right moment to use them." "Why didn't you use them before?" Clara's voice was raw. "Because your mother asked me not to. She was afraid of what Dale would do to you if he was cornered." Margaret set the letters down carefully. "But she's gone now, and you're here, and I think it's time Dale Whitfield faced justice." Clara stared at her. "You can really stop him." "I can put him in prison," Margaret said flatly. "The territorial marshal is due here in 3 days. I've been corresponding with him for months, building a case. With these letters and the evidence I have, Dale won't just lose his ranch. He'll lose his freedom." Hope flared in Clara's chest, painful and bright. "And Cyrus Brennan?" "He's a bastard, but he's not a criminal. Once Dale's arrested, the marriage contract will be void. You'll be free." Clara's hands shook so badly tea slopped over the rim of the cup. Margaret took it from her gently, set it aside, and pulled Clara into another fierce hug. "You did it," Margaret whispered. "You got away. You survived, and now you're going to get your life back." Clara clung to her, sobbing, and for the first time in 2 years she let herself believe it might be true. Jacob stood near the door, his hat in his hands, watching the two women with an expression that was equal parts relief and something deeper, something that looked like old grief finally beginning to heal. Margaret released Clara and turned to him. "Thank you for bringing her here safely. Your sister would be proud." Jacob's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'm glad I could help." "Will you stay? At least for tonight?" "If you have room." "I always have room for you, Jacob Hale." Margaret stood, her manner brisk and businesslike again. "Clara, you'll sleep upstairs in the room at the end of the hall. There's a lock on the door, and I'm the only one with a key besides you. You're safe here." Clara wiped her eyes. "Thank you. For everything." Margaret's expression softened. "Your mother was my dearest friend. Taking care of you is an honor, not a burden." She showed Clara upstairs to a small, clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the parade ground. Clara set her bag down and stood there for a moment, staring at the lock on the door. A lock she controlled, a door only she could open. Freedom, in the shape of a simple brass mechanism. She locked it, unlocked it, locked it again. Testing. Believing. Then she sank down on the bed and let herself cry until there were no tears left. Downstairs, Margaret poured whiskey for Jacob and herself, and they sat in the kitchen while the boarding house settled into evening quiet around them. "She's been through hell," Margaret said quietly. "I know." Jacob stared into his glass. "She's stronger than she thinks, though." "She'll need to be. Dale won't give up easily. And when the marshal arrests him, there'll be a trial. She'll have to testify." "She can handle it." Margaret studied him over the rim of her glass. "You care about her." Jacob didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. "I helped her because it was the right thing to do." "That's not what I asked." Jacob met her eyes. "I barely know her, Margaret." "And yet you brought her here, protected her, gave her hope when she had none." Margaret set her glass down. "That's not nothing, Jacob." "It's not enough either." Jacob's voice was rough. "She's been controlled, manipulated, sold like livestock. The last thing she needs is another man trying to stake a claim." "I'm not suggesting you stake a claim. I'm suggesting you don't walk away just yet." Margaret leaned forward. "She trusts you. That's rare for a woman who's been hurt the way she has. Don't throw that away." Jacob was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What if I make it worse?" "What if you make it better?" Margaret countered. "You won't know unless you stay." Jacob finished his whiskey in one swallow, set the glass down, and stood. "I'll stay until the marshal comes. Make sure she's safe. After that—" He trailed off, shook his head. "After that, she'll have you. And she won't need me anymore." Margaret watched him walk out, her expression thoughtful. Upstairs, Clara lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the fort settling for the night. Voices, footsteps, the distant whinny of horses. She thought about her mother, about the years of silence and fear that had killed her as surely as any poison. She thought about Dale and the reckoning that was coming. And she thought about Jacob, the stranger who'd given her shelter, protection, and something she'd almost forgotten existed. Kindness without expectation, safety without control, a chance to choose her own path. She didn't know what would happen when the marshal came. Didn't know if justice would truly be served or if Dale would find some way to twist the truth and walk free. But for tonight, she had a locked door, a warm bed, and the knowledge that she wasn't alone. And that was enough. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was, her heart lurching with the old panic, her hand reaching instinctively for the knife she'd kept under her pillow for 2 years. Then she saw the lock on the door, the clean white curtains, the pitcher and basin on the washstand, and memory flooded back. She was at Fort Kearney. She was with Margaret Ross. She was safe. The relief was so sharp it hurt. Clara got up slowly, her body stiff from the hard ride and the emotional storm of the previous day. She washed her face and hands in the basin, braided her hair with trembling fingers, and studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked different, thinner, paler, with shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. But there was something else too, a hardness around her mouth, a wariness in her gaze that spoke of survival and strength earned through suffering. She looked like someone who'd fought for her life and won. Clara unlocked the door and made her way downstairs, following the sound of voices in the kitchen. She found Margaret at the stove, frying eggs and bacon, while Jacob sat at the table with a cup of coffee, his rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. They both looked up when she entered, and Jacob stood immediately, the gesture automatic and respectful. "Morning," he said quietly. "You sleep all right?" Clara nodded, suddenly shy. In the clear light of day, with the immediate danger past, she didn't quite know how to be around him. He'd seen her at her most vulnerable, most desperate. He knew things about her that even her mother hadn't known, the depth of her fear, the rawness of her pain. It made her feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety. Margaret seemed to sense it. She gestured Clara to a chair, set a plate of food in front of her, and poured her coffee without fuss or commentary. "Eat," Margaret said briskly. "You're too thin, and you'll need your strength for what's coming." Clara picked up her fork, though her stomach was tight with nerves. "What is coming?" Margaret exchanged a glance with Jacob, then sat down across from Clara. "The territorial marshal arrives tomorrow. His name is Elias Grant, and he's a good man, thorough, fair, not easily bought or intimidated. I've sent word that you're here and that we have evidence against Dale Whitfield. Grant will want to hear your testimony directly." Clara's hand tightened on her fork. "What if Dale comes back before then?" "He won't get to you," Jacob said, his voice flat and certain. "Margaret and I talked last night. I'm staying until Grant arrives and Dale's in custody. If Whitfield shows up here, he'll have to go through me first." "And me," Margaret added. "I faced down worse men than Dale Whitfield, and I'm still here. He doesn't scare me." Clara looked between them, these two people who barely knew her but had already risked so much on her behalf. "Why are you doing this? Either of you?" Margaret's expression softened. "Because your mother was my friend, and she trusted me to protect you. And because some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is hard." Jacob didn't answer immediately. He just looked at Clara with those dark, steady eyes and said quietly, "Because it's right. And because someone should have done it sooner." Clara felt her throat tighten. She looked down at her plate and forced herself to eat, to focus on the simple physical act of chewing and swallowing, because if she didn't, she was going to start crying again, and she was tired of being weak. But Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand, her grip warm and strong. "Tears aren't weakness, child. They're proof you survived something that should have broken you. Don't be ashamed of them." Clara met her eyes, saw the understanding there, and nodded. They finished breakfast in companionable quiet, and then Margaret stood and began clearing the dishes. "I have work to do today. Accounts to settle, supplies to order. Jacob, would you mind staying close to the house? Just in case." "Already planned on it," Jacob said. He looked at Clara. "You should rest, read, sleep, whatever you need. You're safe here." But Clara shook her head. "I can't just sit. I'll go crazy if I sit." Margaret smiled. "Then help me in the kitchen. I'm making bread this morning, and an extra pair of hands would be welcome." So Clara rolled up her sleeves and spent the morning kneading dough, her hands working the rhythm her mother had taught her years ago. The familiar motion was soothing, grounding, and as she worked, she told Margaret stories about her mother. Small things, everyday memories that felt precious now that Mary Whitfield was gone. Margaret listened, adding her own stories of the woman she'd known before Clara was born. "Your mother was fearless," Margaret said, shaping loaves with practiced efficiency. "When we first came west, she was the one who insisted on driving the wagon when the regular driver took sick. She'd never handled a team before in her life, but she learned fast. Said she wasn't about to trust someone else with her family's safety." "She stopped being fearless after my father died," Clara said quietly. "Or maybe she just ran out of strength." "She did what she had to do to keep you alive," Margaret said firmly. "Don't judge her for the choices she made under impossible circumstances. She loved you. That's what matters." Clara blinked back tears and focused on the dough, her hands moving in the old familiar pattern. While the bread baked, filling the kitchen with warmth and the smell of yeast, Margaret brought out the document she'd mentioned, a thick folder of papers covered in dense handwriting and official stamps. "This is everything I've collected over the past year," Margaret said, spreading the papers across the table. "Bills of sale for goods that were never delivered, loans Dale took out in other men's names, testimonies from ranch hands he cheated out of their wages, and this—" She pulled out a letter, the paper yellowed and creased. "This is from a land office clerk in Omaha. Dale forged your mother's signature to sell off parcels of the ranch she'd inherited from your father. The money went into Dale's private accounts." Clara stared at the letter, rage and grief warring in her chest. He stole from her. Even when she was dying, he was stealing from her. "He's a parasite," Margaret said bluntly. "But parasites die when you cut them off from their host. And that's exactly what we're going to do." She walked Clara through the evidence piece by piece, explaining what each document proved and how it connected to the larger pattern of Dale's crimes. By the time they finished, Clara's head was spinning with details, but one thing was clear. Dale Whitfield wasn't just a cruel man. He was a criminal, and the proof was damning. "Will it be enough?" Clara asked. "More than enough," Margaret said. "When Grant sees this, Dale won't just lose the ranch. He'll lose his freedom for a very long time." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear that had been there so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Everything all right?" "Better than all right," Margaret said. "We're ready for Grant." Jacob's gaze moved to Clara, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or solidarity. "Good," he said quietly. "Then we just have to make it through the next 24 hours. Those 24 hours stretched out like a lifetime. Clara tried to keep busy, helping Margaret with chores around the boarding house, mending linens, sweeping floors, anything to keep her hands occupied and her mind from spiraling into dark places. But every time she heard hoofbeats outside, her heart jumped. Every time the door opened, she tensed, expecting to see Dale's face. Jacob stayed close, always within sight or earshot, his presence a steady reassurance. He didn't hover or crowd her, but he was there, reading in the parlor while she sewed, checking the perimeter while she helped Margaret hang laundry, sitting on the porch in the evening with his rifle across his knees. As the sun began to set on that first day, Clara found herself standing at the window of her room, looking out over the fort. Soldiers moved about their business, horses stamped in the corrals, lamps flickered to life in windows across the compound. Normal life, safe life, the kind of life she'd almost forgotten existed. There was a soft knock at her door, and she turned to find Jacob standing in the hallway. "Just checking on you," he said, "making sure you're all right." Clara managed a small smile. "I'm not sure I know how to be all right anymore." Jacob leaned against the doorframe, careful not to cross the threshold into her room. "It takes time. After something like what you've been through, you don't just wake up one morning and feel normal again. You have to learn it, little by little." "How do you know?" "Because I've been there." Jacob's voice was rough. "After my sister died, I spent a year waiting for the world to make sense again. It never did. But I learned to live with it, learned to find small things that mattered, and eventually that was enough." Clara moved to the doorway, stopping just short of where he stood. "What things?" Jacob thought for a moment. "Sunrise, good coffee, a horse that knows its job, letters from friends who don't forget you exist." He met her eyes. "People who show up when they say they will. Like you showed up for me. Like I should have shown up for Emily." The pain in his voice was raw, immediate. "But yeah, like that." Clara reached out, hesitated, then gently touched his arm. "She'd be proud of you, for helping me." Jacob looked down at her hand on his sleeve, and something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or gratitude. "I hope so." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them comfortable and strangely intimate, before Jacob stepped back and cleared his throat. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Clara nodded, but as she watched him walk away down the hall, she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Not attraction, not yet, maybe not ever, but connection, recognition. The sense that this man understood her in ways most people never would, and that scared her almost as much as it comforted her. The next morning dawned cold and clear, frost glittering on the ground outside. Clara dressed with care, choosing the cleanest of her few dresses, braiding her hair tightly, trying to make herself look respectable and credible. Margaret inspected her critically, then nodded. "You look like a woman who's survived hell and come out the other side. That's exactly what Grant needs to see." Jacob was already at the kitchen table, his rifle cleaned and loaded, his expression grim. "Grant's due before noon. Once he arrives, things are going to move fast." "How fast?" Claire asked. "If the evidence is as strong as Margaret says, Grant will issue a warrant for Dale's arrest immediately," Jacob said. "He'll send deputies to the ranch to bring him in. Could be done by tonight." Claire's stomach churned. "What if Dale resists?" "Then it gets messy," Jacob said bluntly. "But that's not your problem. Your job is to tell Grant the truth and let him do his job." The hours crawled by. Clara paced, unable to sit still, her nerves stretched to breaking. Margaret tried to distract her with small tasks, but nothing helped. And then, just before 11, a rider appeared on the road from the south. But it wasn't the marshal. It was one of Dale's men, the tall one with the scar Clara recognized from her stepfather's ranch. He rode straight up to the boarding house, dismounted, and climbed the steps to the porch. Jacob was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to block the door. The man stopped, his hands visible and empty, his expression wary. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to speak to Miss Whitfield." "She's not interested," Jacob said flatly. "It's important. It's about Dale." Margaret appeared behind Jacob, her face hard. "Whatever Dale has to say, he can say it to the marshal when he's arrested. Now get off my property." The man didn't move. "Dale's dead." The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" "He's dead," the man repeated. "Happened last night. He was drinking, got into a fight with Cyrus Brennan over money. Over you, really. Brennan said Dale owed him for breach of contract. Dale said the deal was off because you ran. They argued, Dale drew on him, and Brennan shot him." Jacob's grip tightened on the rifle. "And you're telling us this why?" "Because Brennan's claiming self-defense, and he's got 2 witnesses who'll back him up. But the thing is," the man looked at Clara, his expression uncomfortable. "The thing is, Dale wasn't the only one running that operation. Brennan was in it with him. All those deals, all that stolen money, Brennan was taking a cut, and now that Dale's gone, Brennan's trying to tie up loose ends." "Meaning what?" Margaret's voice was sharp. "Meaning he knows about the evidence. Dale told him about the letters, about Margaret Ross. And Brennan's not going to wait around for the marshal to figure out he's dirty too." The man shifted his weight. "He's coming here, today. And he's not coming alone." Clara's legs went weak. Jacob caught her arm, steadied her, his face like stone. "How many men?" Jacob asked. 4, maybe 5. "All armed," Margaret swore. "When?" "Could be here within the hour, maybe less." Jacob turned to Margaret. "Get Clara upstairs, lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. Jacob met her eyes, and there was something fierce and unyielding in his gaze. "I'm going to hold them off until the marshal gets here, and if I can't hold them off, I'm going to make sure they don't get to you." "You can't face 5 men alone." "I'm not alone." Margaret pulled a shotgun from behind the counter, checked the load. "I've defended this house before. I'll do it again." The ranch hand cleared his throat. "I'll help. Dale was a bastard, but I didn't sign up for murder. And I'm not about to let Brennan kill a woman just to cover his tracks." Jacob studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "What's your name?" "Tom. Tom Garrett?" "All right, Tom. You know how to shoot?" "Well enough." "Then find yourself a rifle and watch the south side." Jacob turned to Margaret. "You take the west. I'll cover north and east. If they come, we hold them until Grant arrives." Clara grabbed Jacob's arm. "This is insane. You're going to get yourself killed." "Better me than you," Jacob said quietly. He pulled free, gentle but firm, and looked at Margaret. "Get her upstairs. Now!" Margaret took Clara's hand and pulled her toward the stairs, but Clara resisted, her eyes on Jacob. "Please," she whispered, "please don't die for me." Jacob's expression softened just for a moment. "I'm not planning on it." But if it comes to that, he paused, seemed to search for the right words. If it comes to that, it'll be worth it. Then he turned away and headed for the door. Margaret dragged Clara upstairs, pushed her into the room, and pressed the shotgun into her hands. You know how to use this? Clara nodded numbly. Good. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Jacob. If someone else tries to get in, Margaret's face was hard. You shoot them. Then she was gone, her footsteps quick and sure on the stairs. Clara locked the door with shaking hands, moved to the window and looked out. The fort was quiet, too quiet. Soldiers went about their business, unaware that violence was heading their way. In the distance, Clara could see the road, empty for now, but not for long. She gripped the shotgun, her heart hammering, and waited. The minutes stretched out like hours. Clara kept watch from the window, her hands slick with sweat on the shotgun stock, her breath coming short and fast. Then she saw them. 5 riders, coming hard from the south, dust rising behind them. They didn't slow as they approached the fort, didn't veer toward the gates. They came straight for the boarding house. Cyrus Brennan was in the lead, his face cold and determined, a rifle in his hand. Clara's stomach lurched. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, his rifle leveled, his voice carrying clear and strong across the distance. That's far enough, Brennan. You're not welcome here. Brennan reined in his horse 20 yards from the house, his men spreading out behind him. I'm not here for you, Hale. I'm here for the girl. Dale's debt transfers to me now, and I mean to collect. Dale's dead, and his debts died with him, Jacob said. Clara Whitfield is under the protection of Margaret Ross and the territorial marshal. You've got no claim on her. I've got a contract, signed and paid for. Signed by a man who's now a corpse and paid for with stolen money, Margaret called from the west window. That contract's worth less than the paper it's written on. Brennan's face darkened. I'm not leaving without her. Yes, Jacob said quietly, you are. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension stretched taut as wire, the air thick with the promise of violence. Then Brennan raised his rifle, and Jacob fired first. The shot cracked across the morning air, and Brennan's horse reared, screaming. Brennan fought to control it, his own shot going wild. All hell broke loose. Brennan's men scattered, taking cover behind water troughs and fence posts, returning fire. Jacob dropped behind the porch railing, working the lever on his rifle with smooth efficiency. Margaret's shotgun roared from the side window, buckshot tearing into the dirt near one of the riders. Tom Garrett fired from the south side, his aim true, and one of Brennan's men went down with a cry. Clara watched from the window, frozen, useless, her finger on the shotgun's trigger but unable to move. This was happening because of her. These people were risking their lives because of her. The thought was unbearable. Jacob took a hit. Clara saw him jerk back, saw blood bloom on his shoulder, but he kept firing, kept moving, his face set in grim determination. Margaret reloaded and fired again, cursing like a sailor. Tom took cover behind a pile of firewood, trading shots with 2 of Brennan's men, and then, cutting through the chaos like a knife, came the sound of a bugle. Fort soldiers, drawn by the gunfire, were pouring out of the barracks, rifles in hand, and riding at their head was a man in a long coat with a silver star pinned to his chest. Marshal Elias Grant had arrived. His voice boomed across the compound. Drop your weapons, now! Brennan's men hesitated, looked at each other, looked at their boss. Brennan's face was twisted with rage and desperation. He swung his rifle toward the boarding house, toward the window where Clara stood. Jacob saw it, shouted a warning, and threw himself into the line of fire. The shot caught him high in the chest, spinning him around, and he went down hard. Clara screamed. Margaret's shotgun roared again, and Brennan's horse bolted, throwing him to the ground. Soldiers swarmed the scene, disarming Brennan's men, shouting orders, securing the area. But Clara didn't see any of it. She dropped the shotgun, tore the door open, and ran. Clara flew down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps. Margaret's shouts following her but not stopping her. She burst through the front door into chaos. Soldiers everywhere, Brennan on his knees with his hands behind his head, his men being shackled, smoke hanging in the air like fog. And Jacob, lying motionless on the porch, blood spreading across his chest. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch, afraid not to. Jacob, Jacob, please. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and pain-glazed. Clara. His voice was barely a whisper. You're all right? I'm fine. You're the one who's... Her voice broke. You're the one who got shot, you idiot. Why did you do that? Why did you... Couldn't let him... Jacob coughed, winced. Couldn't let him hurt you. Margaret was there suddenly, pushing Clara aside with firm hands. Move, child. Let me see. She tore open Jacob's shirt, examined the wound with quick, efficient movements. Her face was grim but not panicked. Bullet went through. Missed the lung, I think, but he's losing blood fast. We need to get him inside. Two soldiers materialized, lifted Jacob carefully between them. He groaned, his face going white, but he kept his eyes on Clara as they carried him into the boarding house. Clara followed, her hands shaking, her mind blank with terror. They laid Jacob on the kitchen table, and Margaret went to work immediately, barking orders at one of the soldiers to fetch her medical kit, sending another for hot water and clean cloths. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd done this before, cutting away Jacob's shirt, cleaning the wound, packing it with strips of linen to slow the bleeding. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, useless and terrified. Jacob's eyes found hers through the pain. Not your fault. Yes, it is, Clara whispered. This is all my fault. You got shot because of me. Margaret's house got shot up because of me. Tom Garrett nearly died because of me. Clara. Margaret's voice cut through the spiral. Stop. This is not your fault. This is Dale Whitfield's fault for being a criminal and Cyrus Brennan's fault for being a murdering bastard. You are the victim here, not the cause. Do you understand me? Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to Jacob. I need to stitch this. It's going to hurt like hell. You got anything to bite down on? Jacob managed a weak smile. My pride. That'll do. Margaret threaded a needle with steady hands. Clara, either come hold his hand or get out. I can't have you fainting on me. Clara moved without thinking, crossing to the table and taking Jacob's hand in both of hers. His fingers were cold, his grip weak. I'm here, she said softly. I'm right here. Jacob's eyes locked on hers. And when Margaret made the first stitch, his hand tightened convulsively, but he didn't look away. Clara talked to him through it, nonsense words, fragments of stories her mother used to tell, anything to keep him focused on her voice instead of the pain. And when Margaret finally tied off the last stitch and stepped back, wiping blood from her hands, Jacob's grip on Clara's hand hadn't loosened. He'll live, Margaret said, her voice rough with exhaustion, barring infection or fever. Next few days will tell. Clara felt her knees buckle, and one of the soldiers caught her, guided her to a chair. Margaret covered Jacob with a blanket, checked his pulse, then looked at Clara. He needs rest, and so do you. But first, Marshal Grant is waiting to speak with you. Clara looked up, dazed. The marshal. He's in the parlor. He's already arrested Brennan and his men, but he needs your testimony to make the charges stick. Margaret's expression softened. I know you're exhausted, but this needs to be done now, while everything's fresh. Clara wiped her eyes, took a shaky breath, and nodded. All right. She rose on trembling legs, cast one last look at Jacob, pale and still but breathing, and followed Margaret to the parlor. Marshal Elias Grant was a tall man in his 50s with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He stood when Clara entered, his manner respectful but assessing. Miss Whitfield, he said, his voice deep and measured. I'm Marshal Grant. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but I need to ask you some questions. Are you able to answer them now? Clara sat in the chair Margaret indicated, folded her hands in her lap to stop them shaking, and met the marshal's gaze. Yes, sir. Grant pulled out a small notebook and pencil. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your stepfather, Dale Whitfield, and why you fled from his ranch 4 days ago. So Clara told him everything. The years of control after her mother's death, the forced engagement to Cyrus Brennan, the letters her mother had left revealing Dale's crimes. She told him about the night she ran, about Jacob finding her in his cabin, about the journey to Fort Kearney and the men who'd come looking for her. Margaret added details, producing the folder of evidence, the forged documents, the testimonies, the financial records that proved Dale's systematic theft and fraud. Grant listened without interruption, making notes, his expression growing darker with every revelation. When Clara finished, her voice was hoarse and her hands were knotted together so tightly her knuckles were white. Grant set down his pencil and looked at her with something that might have been respect. Miss Whitfield, what you've survived would have broken most people. The fact that you're sitting here, coherent and willing to testify, says something about your character. Clara didn't feel strong. She felt like she was held together with wire and willpower and nothing else. What happens now? She asked. Now I take Cyrus Brennan into custody and charge him with attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud. Tom Garrett's testimony about Dale's death will be critical. If Brennan killed Dale to silence him, that's murder, not self-defense. Grant flipped through his notes. As for Dale Whitfield's estate, given the evidence of fraud and theft, the court will likely appoint an administrator to sort through the finances and return what was stolen. That includes the ranch and property that rightfully belonged to your mother. Claire stared at him. The ranch? It was your mother's inheritance, not Dale's. He had no legal right to sell any part of it without her consent. Consent he forged. The sales will be voided and the property will revert to you as her sole heir. The room seemed to tilt. I don't want it. I don't want anything that belonged to him. It didn't belong to him, Grant said gently. It belonged to your mother, and now it belongs to you. What you do with it, sell it, keep it, burn it to the ground, that's your choice. But it's yours. Clara felt Margaret's hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. You don't have to decide today, Margaret said. You don't have to decide this month. Take your time. Figure out what you want. What Clara wanted was to not have to think about any of this. What she wanted was to rewind time to before her father died, before her mother married Dale, before everything went wrong. But that wasn't an option. So she nodded and said, Thank you, Marshal. Grant stood, tucked his notebook away. I'll need you to sign a formal statement tomorrow, but for now, get some rest. You're safe, Miss Whitfield. Brennan's going to prison for a long time, and he won't be the only one. I'm going to make sure everyone involved in this operation answers for what they've done. After Grant left, Clara sat in the parlor staring at nothing while Margaret moved around her, tidying up, putting things in order with the brisk efficiency that seemed to be her way of processing trauma. Finally, Margaret sat down across from Clara and said quietly, How are you holding up? Clara laughed, the sound brittle and sharp. I don't know. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. Dale's dead, Brennan's arrested, Jacob got shot protecting me, and I'm free, I think. But it doesn't feel real. It will, Margaret said. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. You'll wake up one morning and realize that you're not afraid anymore, that you can make choices without someone's permission, that your life is yours. She paused. It takes time, Clara. Healing always does. What if I don't know how to heal? Then you learn, the same way you learned how to survive. Margaret reached across and took Clara's hand. And you don't do it alone. You have me. You have Jacob when he's back on his feet. You have Tom Garrett, who risked his neck to warn us. You have people who care whether you live or die, and that matters. Clara's throat tightened. I've never had that before. Not since my parents. Well, you have it now. Get used to it. Clara managed a watery smile. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now go sit with Jacob while I make dinner. He'll rest easier if he knows you're there. Clara found Jacob in the small room off the kitchen where Margaret had moved him after stitching him up. He was propped up on pillows, his chest bandaged, his face pale but his eyes open. He turned his head when she entered, and something in his expression eased. Hey. Hey yourself. Clara pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. How do you feel? Like I got shot. Jacob's mouth quirked in a faint smile. But I felt worse. Don't joke about this. Clara's voice shook. You almost died. For me. Again. Not for you. Jacob said quietly. Because of what was right, there's a difference. Is there? Clara looked down at her hands. Because from where I'm sitting, you keep putting yourself in danger because I exist, and I don't know how to live with that. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come here." Clara hesitated, then moved closer. Jacob reached out with his good hand and took hers. His grip was weak but deliberate. "Listen to me. What happened today wasn't your fault. What happened to my sister wasn't your fault. You didn't ask for any of this. You were a victim of cruel men who saw you as property, and you fought back the only way you could. That takes courage, Clara, real courage." "I don't feel courageous. I feel—" Her voice broke. "I feel like I'm drowning, and everyone around me keeps throwing themselves into the water to save me, and I don't know how to stop it." "You don't stop it. You accept it. You let people help you." Jacob's thumb brushed across her knuckles, the gesture gentle and deliberate. "And someday, when you're on solid ground again, you help someone else. That's how it works." Clara looked at their joined hands, his calloused and scarred, hers small and pale in his grip. She thought about the last 4 days, about everything he'd done without asking for anything in return. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Jacob's eyes searched her face. "Because when I look at you, I see someone worth saving, someone strong and brave and deserving of a life that doesn't hurt. And maybe," he paused, seemed to struggle with the words, "maybe helping you is helping me too. Maybe it's giving me a chance to do right by someone when I couldn't do right by Emily." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I'm not her." "I know." Jacob's voice was rough. "You're you, and that's enough." They sat in silence after that, hands linked, the weight of the day settling around them. Eventually, Jacob's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion pulling him under, but he didn't let go of Clara's hand, and Clara didn't pull away. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Jacob healed slowly, his fever staying low, his wound showing no signs of infection. Margaret tended him with gruff efficiency, changing bandages and forcing broth down his throat when he protested that he wasn't hungry. Clara helped where she could, reading to Jacob when he was awake, sitting with him when he slept, trying to reconcile the fact that this man, this near stranger, had risked his life for her not once, but twice. Marshal Grant came and went, taking formal statements, building his case against Brennan and the remaining members of Dale's operation. Tom Garrett testified that Dale had pulled his gun first, but that Brennan had goaded him into it, knowing Dale was drunk and volatile. The self-defense claim fell apart under scrutiny, and Brennan was charged with murder. Clara signed papers, answered questions, and tried to process the fact that she was suddenly the sole owner of a ranch she'd never wanted, and a fortune built on her mother's stolen inheritance. "What are you going to do with it?" Jacob asked one afternoon, when he was finally strong enough to sit up without looking like he might pass out. Clara sat in the chair by his bed, mending one of his shirts, the bullet hole carefully patched, the blood stain soaked out. "I don't know. Sell it, probably. I can't go back there. Too many bad memories." "Makes sense." Jacob watched her work, his expression thoughtful. "What will you do instead?" "I don't know that either." Clara set down the needle and thread, met his eyes. "For 2 years, all I thought about was getting away. I never thought past that. Never let myself imagine a future because it seemed impossible. It's not impossible anymore." "No." Clara's voice was soft. "But I don't know what to do with it. With freedom. With choices." Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could stay here. Margaret would love the company, and Fort Kearney's not a bad place to start over. What about you?" The question was out before Clara could stop it, and she felt her cheeks heat. "I mean, you said you ride routes for the stage line. You travel. You're not here permanently." "No," Jacob agreed. "But I come through every couple weeks, and I've been thinking—" He paused, seemed to choose his words carefully. "I've been thinking maybe it's time I stopped running from ghosts and started building something real. A home base. Somewhere to come back to." Clara's heart beat faster. "Here? Maybe." Jacob's eyes held hers. If there was a reason to. The air between them felt charged, full of things unsaid. Clara looked away first, her hands trembling as she picked up the needle again. "You should focus on healing, not on whatever this is." "This?" Jacob's voice was gentle, not pushing but not retreating either. What do you think this is, Clara? She didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was too new, too fragile, and she didn't trust it yet. She didn't trust herself yet. Jacob seemed to understand. He let the subject drop, and they sat in companionable silence while Clara finished mending his shirt. On the fourth day after the shooting, Jacob was strong enough to walk outside. Clara hovered anxiously while he made his slow, painful way to the porch, but he waved off her concern with a faint smile. "I'm fine. Just need to remember how my legs work." They sat on the porch steps in the late afternoon sun, watching the fort go about its business. Soldiers drilled on the parade ground. Wagons rolled in with supplies, horses stamped and nickered in the corrals. Normal life. Safe life. Clara breathed it in and tried to believe it was real. "Grant came by while you were sleeping," she said. "He wanted me to know that Brennan's trial is set for next month. He'll need me to testify." Jacob nodded. "You going to be all right with that?" "I think so. Margaret said she'd come with me, and Tom Garrett's testifying too." "Good." Jacob stretched his legs out carefully, wincing. "What about the ranch?" "I've decided to sell it. There's a land agent in Omaha who handles estate sales. Margaret's helping me with the paperwork." Clara picked at a thread on her skirt. "I'm going to use some of the money to pay back the people Dale cheated. The rest, I don't know yet. Margaret says I should invest it, make it work for me. But honestly, I'm just relieved to be rid of it." "That's fair." Jacob was quiet for a moment, then said, "What are you going to do after? After the trial? After the sale?" Clara looked out at the horizon, at the endless sky and the land rolling away in all directions. "I thought I might stay here for a while. Help Margaret with the boarding house. Learn how to live without looking over my shoulder. And after that? I don't know." Clara turned to look at him. "Do I need to know right now?" Jacob met her gaze, and there was something warm in his eyes, something that made her heart skip. "No. You don't need to know, but when you figure it out, I hope you'll tell me." "Why?" Jacob reached over and took her hand, the gesture slow and careful, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. "Because I care what happens to you," he said simply. "Because you matter to me. And because I'd like to be part of whatever future you're building, if you'll have me." Clara stared at him, her throat tight. "Jacob, I'm not asking for promises," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I want you to know that you're not alone, that whatever you decide, wherever you go, you'll have someone in your corner, someone who sees you and values you and thinks you're worth knowing." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "You barely know me." "I know enough." Jacob's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "I know you're brave. I know you're stubborn as hell. I know you'd rather run than ask for help, but when you do ask, you mean it. I know you loved your mother and you miss her every day. I know you're terrified of trusting people because the people you trusted hurt you." He paused. "And I know that when you smile, really smile, not the polite version you give strangers, it's worth everything." Clara's breath hitched. "How can you say that? After everything that's happened, after everything you've seen?" "Because it's true." Jacob's voice was steady, certain. "You survived something that should have destroyed you, Clara. And instead of letting it make you cruel or bitter, you're still trying to do right by people, still trying to be kind. That's not weakness, that's strength." Clara looked down at their joined hands, at the way his seemed to dwarf hers, rough and scarred but so careful. She thought about the last 4 days, about the way he'd protected her without controlling her, helped her without diminishing her, cared for her without demanding anything in return. She thought about the way her heart beat faster when he looked at her, the way she felt safer when he was near, the way she'd started to imagine a future that included him in it. And she realized, with a jolt that was equal parts terror and hope, that she was falling in love with him. The knowledge should have terrified her, should have sent her running the way she'd run from everything else that threatened to trap her. But it didn't. Because Jacob Hale wasn't a trap. He was a door standing open, waiting for her to choose whether to walk through. And for the first time in 2 years, Clara thought she might be ready to choose. She didn't say it out loud, not yet. The words were too new, too precious, and she needed to hold them close a little longer. But she squeezed his hand and said softly, "Thank you for everything." Jacob smiled, and it transformed his face, chasing away the shadows and making him look younger, lighter. "You're welcome." They sat on the porch until the sun set, hands linked, watching the day fade into twilight. And when Clara finally stood to go inside, Jacob let her hand slip from his without protest. But the warmth of his touch lingered long after she was gone. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm Clara had never known before, predictable, safe, and surprisingly full. She woke each morning in the small room at the end of Margaret's hall, unlocked the door she no longer needed to lock, and went downstairs to help with breakfast. She learned to make biscuits the way Margaret liked them, fluffy and golden, and how to brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She swept floors, changed linens, served meals to the rotating cast of travelers who passed through the boarding house, and slowly, carefully, she learned what it felt like to have a life that belonged to her. Jacob stayed through his recovery, longer than he probably should have, making excuses about needing to regain his strength before riding route again. Margaret saw through it immediately, but said nothing, just smiled knowingly and made sure there was always an extra plate at dinner. Clara and Jacob fell into an easy companionship during those weeks. They talked for hours on the porch in the evenings, about everything and nothing, his years riding for the stage line, her memories of her parents before everything went wrong, books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd almost forgotten they had. Jacob taught her to play chess on a battered board Margaret kept in the parlor, and Clara discovered she had a ruthless strategic mind that delighted in backing his king into impossible corners. "You're terrifying," Jacob said one evening after she'd beaten him for the third time in a row. "Remind me never to underestimate you." Clara smiled, the real smile he'd talked about, the one that made her eyes light up. "Too late. You already did. Remember when you found me in your cabin and I was holding that little knife like it could actually stop you? I remember thinking you had more courage than sense," Jacob said, resetting the board. "And I remember being impressed by that." "Impressed or amused?" "Both." He moved his first pawn. "You looked like a drowned cat ready to fight a wolf. It was adorable and terrifying in equal measure." Clara laughed, and the sound startled her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that, freely, without fear, without watching to see if someone would punish her for the noise. Jacob noticed. He always noticed. "You should do that more often." "Laugh at you?" "Laugh, period." His eyes were warm. "It suits you." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks and focused on the chessboard to hide it. "Your move." The trial came at the end of the month, and Clara traveled to Omaha with Margaret and Marshall Grant. Jacob insisted on coming despite Margaret's protests that he wasn't fully healed, and Clara was secretly grateful for his presence, even if she didn't say it out loud. The courthouse was a stark stone building that smelled of old paper and floor polish. Clara sat in the witness box with her hands folded in her lap and told the jury everything, about Dale, about the forced engagement, about the letters her mother had left, about the night she ran and everything that followed. Cyrus Brennan sat at the defendant's table looking sullen and defiant, his lawyer trying desperately to poke holes in her testimony. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Tom Garrett's account of Dale's death sealed Brennan's fate. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts. Brennan was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, and as the bailiffs led him away in shackles, he turned and spat at Clara. "You'll regret this, girl. You think you've won, but you're nothing. You'll always be nothing." Clara met his eyes and felt nothing but pity. "I'm free," she said quietly. "That's more than you'll ever be." Outside the courthouse, Clara stood on the steps and breathed in the autumn air, crisp and clean and full of possibility. Jacob stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, and Margaret was already planning a celebratory dinner. "It's over," Clara said, still not quite believing it. "It's really over." "The trial's over," Margaret corrected gently. "The healing's just beginning, but you'll get there, child, one day at a time." The sale of the ranch was finalized in mid-October. Clara stood in the land agent's office and signed the papers without a single regret, watching as everything Dale Whitfield had built on stolen ground transferred to a young couple with 2 children and honest faces. They would make it a home again, the way her parents had intended. The money was more than Clara had imagined. enough to repay everyone Dale had cheated, enough to set aside a comfortable sum for her future, and enough left over to make a choice. She made it sitting on Margaret's porch with Jacob on a cool evening when the stars were just beginning to appear. "I want to buy a house," she said without preamble. "Here, in Kearney." Jacob looked up from the saddle strap he was mending. "Yeah?" "Yeah." Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I've been thinking about what you said, about building something real, having a place to come back to. And I realized I want that too. Not for anyone else, for me." Jacob set down the leather and gave her his full attention. "What kind of house?" "Small. Nothing fancy, just big enough for me, with a spare room for when Margaret needs help or when—" She paused, suddenly shy. "When friends come through town." Jacob's mouth quirked. "Friends?" "Friends," Clara said firmly, though her heart was beating faster. "People who ride route for the stage line and need somewhere to rest that's not a boarding house." "Awful specific." "I'm a specific person." Yeah, Jacob laughed, and the sound wrapped around Clara like warmth. "All right, let's find you a house." They spent the next week looking at properties with a local realtor who seemed delighted to have a young woman with cash money and clear ideas about what she wanted. Clara rejected the first 3 houses immediately. Too big, too isolated, too much like the ranch she'd escaped. The 4th house made her stop in the doorway and catch her breath. It was small and neat, painted white with blue shutters, sitting on a corner lot with a garden plot out back and a view of the fort in the distance. Inside it smelled like fresh wood and possibility. 2 rooms downstairs with a kitchen and parlor, 2 rooms upstairs with slanted ceilings and windows that caught the afternoon light. Clara walked through it slowly, running her hand along the walls, testing the floorboards, imagining curtains in the windows and books on the shelves and a life that felt like her own. "What do you think?" the realtor asked, hopefully. Clara turned to Jacob, who was standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What do you think?" "I think it's perfect," he said quietly. "Think it looks like you." Clara felt something settle in her chest, warm and certain. "I'll take it." She moved in 3 weeks later with Margaret's help in a wagon full of borrowed furniture, new linens, and a set of dishes Clara had chosen herself from the general store. Jacob helped haul everything inside, despite Margaret's protest that he'd reopen his wound if he wasn't careful. By evening, the house was transformed. Curtains hung, beds made, the kitchen stocked with staples. Margaret had insisted on making dinner to christen the place, and they sat around Clara's new table eating stew and fresh bread while the lamps burned warm against the gathering dark. "To new beginnings," Margaret said, raising her glass of cider, "and to choosing your own path." "To surviving," Jacob added, his eyes on Clara, "and building something better than what came before." Clara raised her own glass, her throat tight with emotion. "To family, the kind you choose." They drank, and Clara felt the weight of the last 2 years begin to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost like hope. After Margaret left, Jacob lingered, helping Clara wash dishes and bank the fire. The silence between them was comfortable, but charged with something unspoken, and Clara found herself acutely aware of his presence. The way he moved around her small kitchen with easy familiarity. The way his shoulder brushed hers when they stood side by side at the basin. The way he smiled when she handed him a dish to dry. "I should go," he said finally, setting down the towel. "Let you settle in." Clara nodded, but she didn't want him to leave. Didn't want to be alone in this new house, this new life, not yet. Jacob must have seen it in her face because he paused, his hand on the door. "Unless you want me to stay, just for a while. I could sit on the porch, make sure everything's secure." "You could sit inside?" Clara heard herself say. "By the fire, if you want." Jacob turned, his expression careful. "You sure?" Clara thought about the last 2 months, about everything they'd been through together, about the way he'd protected her without controlling her, helped her without diminishing her, cared for her without demanding anything in return. She thought about the way her heart beat faster when he was near, the way she felt safer with him beside her, the way she'd started to imagine a future that included him in it, and she realized she was tired of being afraid, tired of holding back, tired of letting the past dictate her present. "I'm sure," she said. They sat by the fire in Clara's new parlor, in chairs that didn't quite match but were comfortable enough. Jacob told her about the route he'd be riding next week, the stations he'd check, the people he'd see. Clara told him about her plans for the garden, the vegetables she wanted to grow, the flowers her mother used to love. And slowly, as the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, the conversation shifted to quieter things. "I've been thinking," Jacob said, staring into the flames, "about what happens next. For me, I mean." Clara's heart skipped. "And?" "I've been riding Route for 8 years, ever since Emily died. I told myself it was because I liked the freedom, the travel. But the truth is, I was running. From the guilt, from the grief, from everything that reminded me of her. And now?" Jacob looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes, something that made Clara's breath catch. "Now I'm tired of running. I want to stop. I want to build something. I want—" He paused, seemed to gather his courage. "I want a reason to come home." Clara's hands trembled in her lap. "Jacob, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you need time and space, and I'm not asking for promises. But I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. That when I ride out next week, I'll be coming back. And the week after that, I'll come back again. And I'll keep coming back, for as long as you'll let me, because—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Because I love you, Clara. I think I've loved you since the night you stood in my cabin with that knife, terrified but refusing to back down. And I know that scares you, and I know you might not feel the same way, and that's all right. I just needed you to know." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She thought about everything he'd done for her, every kindness, every sacrifice, every moment he'd chosen her safety over his own. She thought about the way he'd stepped back when she needed space, stepped forward when she needed protection, and somehow always seemed to know which was which. She thought about the future she'd been building in her mind, the garden, the house, the quiet life, and realized it had always included him, even when she hadn't let herself admit it. "It does scare me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Loving someone, trusting someone, letting them in. It terrifies me. Because the last time I trusted someone, the last time I let my guard down, it nearly destroyed me." Jacob nodded slowly, and she saw the resignation in his eyes, the bracing for rejection. But Clara wasn't finished. "But you're not Dale," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You're not Brennan. You're not any of the men who hurt me or used me or tried to break me. You're the man who gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. The man who protected me without asking for anything in return. The man who got shot defending me and then apologized for making me worry." Her voice cracked. "You're the man who taught me what kindness looks like, what safety feels like, what love should be." Jacob's breath caught. "Clara, I love you too," she said, the words tumbling out now, unstoppable. "I think I've loved you since you stepped back in that cabin and gave me space instead of taking it. Since you promised me safety and actually kept that promise. Since you looked at me like I was worth protecting, worth knowing, worth loving. And yes, it scares me. But not as much as the thought of losing you, not as much as the thought of you riding out one day and never coming back." Jacob stood, crossed the room in 3 strides, and dropped to his knees in front of her chair. He took her hands in his, and his eyes were bright with emotion. "I'll always come back," he said fiercely. "Every time. I promise you that, Clara. For as long as you want me, I'll come back." Clara reached out with trembling fingers and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the scar she'd wondered about, the warmth of his skin. "Then stay," she whispered. "Not just tonight. Stay. Make this your home too. Make me your home." Jacob's eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, for hesitation. When he found none, he leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, to change her mind. She didn't. Their lips met softly, tentatively, a question and an answer all at once. Clara's hand slid into his hair, and Jacob's arms came around her carefully, holding her like she was something precious and breakable. But Clara wasn't breakable. Not anymore. She was strong and brave, and learning to trust again. And when they finally pulled apart, breathless and shaking, Clara rested her forehead against Jacob's and whispered, "I choose this. I choose you. Not because I need you to save me, but because I want you in my life. Because you make me better. Because when I think about the future, you're in it. Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. I choose you too, every day, for the rest of my life. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, the fire crackling softly behind them. Then Jacob stood, pulled Clara to her feet, and held her close. I need to tell you something, he said against her hair. But I talked to the stage line last week, told them I wanted to take a permanent position here at the fort, managing the station instead of riding route. They agreed, so I'm not going anywhere, Clara. I'm staying. Clara pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide. You did that? Before tonight? Before you knew if I felt the same way? I did it because I knew what I wanted, Jacob said simply. And what I wanted was a life here. With you, if you'd have me. Without you, if that's what you chose. But either way, I was done running. Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were good tears, happy tears, the kind that came from finally believing that good things could happen to her. Stay tonight, she said. Really stay. Not on the porch, not in a chair. Stay with me. Jacob's eyes darkened. Clara, are you sure? I don't want to rush you, don't want you to feel... I'm sure. Clara took his hand and led him toward the stairs. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The months that followed were the happiest Clara had ever known. She and Jacob built a life together in her small white house, a life filled with ordinary moments that felt extraordinary because they were chosen, not forced. Jacob took the position managing the fort station and came home every evening to a warm house and a woman who loved him. Clara tended her garden, helped Margaret at the boarding house when extra hands were needed, and slowly, carefully, learned what it meant to live without fear. They were married in the spring, a small ceremony in Margaret's parlor with Tom Garrett and a handful of friends as witnesses. Clara wore a simple dress the color of cream, and Jacob wore his best shirt with his scar visible and his eyes bright with joy. When Marshal Grant pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Clara like she was the answer to every prayer he'd never said, and Clara kissed him back like he was the home she'd been searching for all her life. Margaret cried, which surprised no one, and Tom Garrett gave a toast about second chances and choosing your own family that left everyone a little misty-eyed. That night, in the house that was now theirs, Jacob and Clara lay in bed with the windows open to let in the spring air. Clara's head rested on Jacob's chest, and his hand traced slow patterns on her back. Do you ever think about it? Jacob asked quietly. About everything that happened? About how we got here? Clara was quiet for a moment, considering. Sometimes, but not the way I used to. I used to think about it and feel only anger and pain and fear. Now when I think about it, I think about how it led me here. To you. To this life. She lifted her head to look at him. I wouldn't wish what happened to me on anyone, but I also wouldn't change it, because changing it would mean not having this, not having you. Jacob's hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. You're the strongest person I know. Clara smiled. I'm the stubbornest person you know. There's a difference. Both can be true. Jacob pulled her closer. I'm grateful for you, Clara Hale. Every day. Clara felt her heart swell with a love so fierce it almost hurt. I'm grateful for you too, for the man who stepped back when I needed space and stepped forward when I needed protection, for the man who taught me that love doesn't have to hurt. It never should, Jacob said fiercely. Not ever. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, safe and whole and home. The years passed gently after that. Clara's garden flourished, producing vegetables that she sold at the fort market and flowers that she gave away to anyone who looked like they needed beauty in their lives. Jacob managed the station with quiet competence, earning the respect of the riders and the gratitude of the travelers who passed through. They were happy in the way that lasting happiness comes, not dramatic or overwhelming, but steady and sure, built on small kindnesses and shared laughter and choosing each other every day. On stormy nights, when thunder rolled across the plains and lightning split the sky, Claire would stand at the window and remember the night she'd ridden through the rain toward an uncertain future. She'd remember the fear, the desperation, The moment she'd stumbled into Jacob's cabin and everything had changed, and Jacob would come up behind her, wrap his arms around her waist, and rest his chin on her shoulder. "You all right?" he'd ask, the same question he'd been asking since that first night. And Clara would lean back against him, solid and warm and real, and say what she always said: "I'm home." Because that's what Jacob was. Not a rescue, not a savior, but a home she'd chosen freely. A partnership built on respect and trust, and a love that had survived the worst and emerged stronger for it. Clara had run from a man who tried to cage her, and she'd found a man who set her free. She'd fled into a storm seeking shelter, and she'd found a future worth living. And on quiet mornings, when the sun rose gold over the plains and Jacob made coffee in their kitchen and Clara planned her day in a life that belonged entirely to her, she would think about the girl she'd been, frightened, controlled, convinced she was worth nothing. And she would whisper a promise to that girl: "You survived. You fought. You won. And the life you built from the ashes is more beautiful than anything they tried to destroy." The scars would always be there, faint but present, a reminder of what she'd endured and overcome. But they no longer defined her. She was Clara Hale now, wife and gardener and friend and survivor, a woman who'd learned that the strongest love comes not from being saved, but from choosing to trust again after every reason not to. And when storms came, and they always did, in one form or another, Clara faced them the way she'd learned to face everything else, with courage, with stubbornness, and with the certainty that she was no longer alone. Because she had Jacob, who'd taught her what safety looked like. She had Margaret, who'd shown her what fierce loyalty meant. She had Tom and the friends they'd made, the community they'd built. But most importantly, she had herself, the woman she'd become through fire and fear, and the choice to keep fighting for a life worth living. And that, Clara knew, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.